My name is Paul Whitescarver, and I am the president of the Thames River Heritage Park. So I want to welcome you here to the Lyman Art Museum. I got to tell you, we did the lecture series last year, mostly on Zoom and some dubious places. I think we tried to have it at Fort Trumbull. Probably not the greatest venues, but I think we've improved the venue. And I want to thank Ellen Anderson and also Eileen from the museum for assisting and doing some great stuff with Deborah Donovan, with Kara, and also I'm going to talk about the MacDonalds here in a minute because they've been steadfast and strong supporters of Thames River Heritage Park for a long time. But there's a lot of people that go forth and conquer and do things for the Thames River Heritage Park that me as the president are really thankful because it makes my job a heck of a lot easier. As Marion, when she found me in being the president of Thames River Heritage Park, she said, "Why did I do this chair?" So I can't. My hat is off to Catherine Foley, who's over in Europe, visiting her daughter, was getting ready for a wedding. And she said, "Hey, can you do the first introduction and then I'll take over after that?" And I said, "Sure, I think I can do that." So I got a lot of help from her and a lot of other people to make sure that we did this introduction correctly. If you're not familiar with me, I am the president of Thames River Heritage Park. I used to be the commanding officer of the submarine base. That's how Marion Galbraith, she and I became friends for the centennial of the base, which was a great success. And then when I retired from the Navy, she said, "Why don't you become the president?" So hopefully, if it were not for Marion and a host of others, I was talking to a couple of people in the room. The park has been an idea, since the 90s, maybe even earlier than that. So this has been a great success for us. But I have a challenge for you. So the next time you come to one of these lectures, you have to bring someone that is younger than you. So you might want to subtract like 20 years. But one of the things that's important about the Thames River Heritage Park is making sure we pass down all that history to the people that really need it aside you guys. You guys are always very supportive, but we need the younger folks to come here and learn about the Thames River because it is, as we say for the park, it's one river, 1,000 stories. So Mary and I do a tour about battlefields and talk about Benedict Arnold, and I talk about submarines and the submarine base and electric boat. But lots of the other tour guides on the river do a tremendous job of making sure that the history of the river is supported and put forth and make sure they make sure that it's carried on, and that's really important for our culture and our regions to do that. My other job is the executive director for the Southeastern Connecticut Enterprise Region, so I try to do economic development. Well, really, I try to make all the municipalities work together. Go figure it out. But with that said, I want to introduce Gail, and I can't say enough about the MacDonalds and their support of the park, whether it be Gail's husband, Bruce, who did a lot of things with us, or Gail or Kara that assists in writing all of the material that a lot of the tour guides use. The MacDonalds do a tremendous a lot of things for the park. And Gail herself, being the historian that she is and the journalist, whether she writes for the New York Times or Hartford Courant or for the Day or writes books that hopefully that I think you're supporting Gail when you buy these books. Make sure you buy them. But the history that she's going to give tonight on Mr. Plant is probably priceless. You might have heard it before, but what a great pleasure it is for us to have someone like Gail teach us about part of the Thames River and the history and how we've progressed. So without further ado, I'll invite Gail up, and thanks for coming tonight.
So thank you, Paul, and thanks for everybody who came out tonight. It's kind of humbling and also a little intimidating. I haven't done a talk in person since before the pandemic. So I did a lot of them when this book first came out about Morton Plant, and then when my second book came out, it was March 2020, and we all know what happened then. So again, thanks for coming out. So just to reiterate a little bit of what Paul said, so the Thames River Heritage Park is very thankful to all the sponsors that have done things for us for help with the boat tours and sponsored boats and these lectures, and have supported us in lots of different ways. And most importantly, thank you to Lyman Allyn Art Museum, because this is a great venue, and I'm so happy that we are here and we're going to be here for the next 5 lectures. Inviting you to become a member or to donate to the Thames River Heritage Park, or become a member of the Lyman Allyn, and both will get you discounts for the other lectures. But I'm here mostly to speak about Morton Plant and the plant family. And so I'm assuming that if you're here this evening, you probably know at least a little bit about the plant family, or have heard of them. And they were one of the most influential Gilded Age families in southeastern Connecticut. They spent only part of the year here, but they were tremendously influential in ways that I'll talk about. So I wanted to first of all introduce you to the characters that I'll talk about tonight. So the first kind of main dude is Morton Plant himself, and that's who most people in this area probably have heard of or know of. Morton was born in 1852 and died in the flu pandemic of 1918. This is a picture of Morton and his second wife, Nellie Capron Plant, aboard one of his yachts. Morton was known as the Commodore for most of his life because of his great love of yachting and sail racing, and he had steamships as well. I like this picture of Morton and Nellie because you can kind of tell that Nellie isn't as enamored of yachting as Morton was. She actually was said to have gotten seasick a lot, and so she did not join Morton often when he went on these long sailing cruises that sometimes took months. Maisie Plant was Morton's third wife, and she had actually 4 husbands. And this is a picture from a little bit later in her life. And you could find this portrait at L&M Hospital, where she gave quite a bit of money at the time of her death. This fellow is Morton's father, Henry Bradley Plant, and he's pictured with a tarpon in Florida. He spent a lot of time in Florida because he developed a railroad system to the west coast of Florida and basically opened up the city of Tampa, which was no more than a swampland before the railroad came there and began to bring people there. Henry Bradley also has the distinction of actually making the money for the family, and Morton more or less spent it. This handsome fellow was the only known biological son of Morton and Nellie. His name also is Henry Plant, and I'll talk a little bit more about all these folks in a while. And this fellow with the distinctive chicken is Phil Plant, who was Morton Plant's adopted son. He was the biological son of Maisie and Selden Manwaring. And but when Maisie and Morton got married, Maisie insisted that he adopt Philip, I'm sure because of the money. So my book dealt mostly with the plants from the aspect of their philanthropy, especially to Connecticut and this region. And so people, the wealthy people of the Gilded Age, I'm sure you know about people like the Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, who established these foundations and gave a lot of money to different charities through the years. And it wasn't just that they thought it was a nice thing to do, but they really felt that they had an obligation because they believed in social Darwinism, which basically meant that they thought that they were preordained by God to be more intelligent than everybody else, and so had an obligation to give back to those less fortunate. But it was also very paternal. So they got to choose where they would give their money. And this may not have been the places where it was really needed. So there was kind of a good side and not really a bad side, but there was another side to the idea of philanthropy. So Morton actually, his father, Henry, wasn't really a philanthropist. He was building the empire. And it was Morton who really started to give back to the community. And a lot of where he gave that money was in southeastern Connecticut, because this area meant a lot to him. He really was enamored of emerging technologies. So he invested in and gave money to things like the railroads, express companies, which were sort of like the UPS of their time, different kinds of steamships and boats. He had a trolley system that ran along the shoreline from New London to New Haven. It was the first kind of interurban trolley line. He invested in the emerging automobile industry. Roads, he built a lot of roads in the town of Groton. A lot of them were to serve his own resort, but they also helped the public. And he invested in the Cape Cod Canal, New York subway system, and he invested in the Wright Brothers company that was involved in aerospace. In Groton, the Plant family had what they called a model farm. It was very popular in that time that these wealthy men would like to be gentlemen farmers. And so many of them established farms of varying size. Morton Plant's farm was huge. It was hundreds and hundreds of acres. Most of it was located in Groton, and it served his own resort, which he built there. Some of you may have heard of, or maybe even remember, the Griswold Hotel, which was located down at Eastern Point, and that was the hotel that Morton Plant developed. He developed what is now the Shenecosset Golf Club. And so a lot of his land after his death ended up in the hands of the state, and a lot of where his farm was is now Groton New London Airport. This is a kind of a full page story that was in the Hartford Courant about his model farms. And Morton took, really exacting pleasure in breeding stock and traveling all over, trying to find the best specimens of cattle and pigs and sheep and exotic birds and plants and all of that. So he had Branford Farms in Groton, and then he had another farm called Plantford Farms in East Lyme. That piece of land is now Stone's Ranch Military, where the National Guard are. So that was originally thousands of acres of land. It was part of the early conservation movement in Connecticut. And Plant also used it as a hunting lodge. So he would stock fish in the streams there and game birds, and he would take friends over and they would stay there and hunt and fish. Most people in this region probably are most familiar with this place that was the Plant's summer home. This is Branford House. And this is how it looked when the Plants lived there. So Branford House is now part of the University of Connecticut's regional campus at Avery Point. And the gardens that are shown in this picture were all demolished when the land was taken over by the military after the Plant's, Henry Plant, the son, died. So this is a picture of how Branford House looks today, or a little bit of it from the side, and the lighthouse there, which was not developed by the Plants, but was developed much later. I think his most important and enduring contribution philanthropically was to the establishment of Connecticut College. So Connecticut College was established in the early years of the 20th century at a time when women had lost the ability to earn a bachelor's degree any place in Connecticut. Wesleyan University had allowed women there for a while until the male students complained about it bitterly, and they withdrew the allowing women. So then there was a movement to establish a college for women exclusively, and it was quite popular to that many communities in Connecticut competed for the right to have this college. New London won out, and the Plant family was big donors to the effort, so they gave money up front. And then Morton was asked to be on the board of directors there, and I'll tell a little story when I get to the gossip section of this talk. But he gave a $1 million bequest that actually was what allowed Connecticut College to actually begin operations, because they had the land and they had raised a lot of money, but they didn't have enough money to kind of keep the college going and pay the faculty and all of the operating expenses. So it was Morton Plant who made that possible. And really, it probably was Nellie Plant who talked Morton into making that donation. This is a picture of Connecticut College under construction. So at first there was only 3 buildings there, and actually 2 of them, Plant and his wife gave the money to build those 2 buildings that are still on the college grounds. They were dormitories, one called Plant Hall and the other called Brantford Hall, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. I wrote this book 7 years ago already, so. So there's some differences of opinion about, whether philanthropists really cared about what they were giving money to. And I can say that Morton Plant chose Southeastern Connecticut to be the recipient of a lot of his bequests, because he knew that he could have more influence here in Southeastern Connecticut. In New York and some of the other bigger cities, he was competing against people who were wealthier than he was. So people like the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Carnegies. But here he had a lot more influence. And even though philanthropy has 2 sides, there's no doubt that what he gave to Southeastern Connecticut definitely improved people's lives at that time. So I talked about, I titled my talk tonight about as being giving gossip and the income gap. And I think that it's important to also recognize that during this time period, there was a tremendous gap in how from the most wealthy people, like the Plants, and the Plants often were reported in the news as being among the wealthiest families in Connecticut at the time. Whether this was accurate or not, it's hard to say. They certainly were not as wealthy as the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies. But in one article that I had found in the New York Times that listed the country's wealthiest families, they did rank in like the top 20. So even for the whole country, they were very, very wealthy. You probably know of the Harknesses, and that was certainly another family in southeastern Connecticut, and they had more wealth than the Plant family. But the Plants kind of reveled more in the celebrity of their roles, so they became a little bit more well-known. But you can't really, I think, talk about them and the people at the top of the heap, income-wise, without also recognizing that even though they gave a lot of money, the policies that they supported and the politics that they promoted really kept an awful lot of other people down. And so this was a time of mass immigration. It was increasing industrialization. Connecticut indeed had gone from a very agrarian state to one of the most industrialized states. The number of immigrants in Connecticut had skyrocketed by 1900 or so. And there were no laws yet that forbade child labor, made industrial safety or pure food and water. There was no income tax. So the wealthy people certainly didn't want to change any of that because it benefited them. So here's a picture. Now the Plant's main house was in New York City, in Manhattan, where many of the country's wealthiest people were living. And so these are pictures that were taken in New York City from early in the 20th century, but how the immigrants and poor were living. Very crowded conditions, unsanitary, no electricity yet, and that kind of thing. But uptown in Manhattan, Morton's neighborhood looked more like this. So it's really difficult to say exactly how Morton and the Plants really viewed the masses, if you will. But there are hints in some of the things they did and the political affiliations that kind of tell us how they probably felt about a lot of things. The Gilded Age indeed was a term that was coined by Connecticut's own author. Well, he was living in Connecticut at this time, Mark Twain, who talked about it being a time when there was a thin gilding of gold that represented the wealthy, that was covering all the kind of terrible squalor that the poor were enduring. So this picture is of when Branford House was under construction. And one of the things that Morton is well known for is that he actually brought in a group of skilled Italian stone cutters to help build Branford House. And this was one of the first larger groups of Italians that were in this area. And so they were housed on this site when Branford House was under construction. And so their dwelling was described as picturesque by somebody at the time, but they lived in actual shanties, just shacks. It looked like actually a homeless encampment, really. And so this quote was from something that was written at the time. The landscape work and road building was done by gangs of laborers who were housed in a picturesque village of shanties near the shore, and the troubles of this colony, their opinions and mutinies and squabbles, at one time became apparently more important than the work in hand. This was written by the architect of Branford House. And he compiled this photo album that he presented to Plant shortly after Branford House was completed. But so people were looking in and thinking, oh, this is so quaint. But if you see the pictures of these shanties, it hardly looks quaint. It looks pretty dismal. Another thing was that Morton was a Democrat, so politically, capital D Democrat. His father, Henry Bradley, was a Republican, which at that point was very much aligned with the party of Abraham Lincoln. And as many sons and daughters do, Morton decided to go a different direction, and he became a Democrat. And he actually hosted an awful lot of Democratic meetings and at the Griswold Hotel. But the Democratic Party at that point was different than it is now. And both parties were actually quite different, I should say. And it was more aligned with the sort of social Darwinism, that theory of social Darwinism. And they elected Woodrow Wilson, for example. They were known for being terribly racist, especially in the South during Reconstruction. They were really the architects of laws that led to the Jim Crow era. And so even though I never found anything really explicit about Morton's views about immigration or poverty or anything like that, probably he was more aligned with that end of things than not. He did do, though, again, it was more like paternalistic. So one thing he did for his Italian workers who came to build Branford House was he gave them the land and the money to establish what became the first Catholic church in Groton, Sacred Heart. And it was not located in the same location it is now. The location is now a electric boat parking lot. But so he had, some respect for these people on some level, but it was going to be on his terms is basically it. As I mentioned, Morton was really a big yachter. And this is Morton on the bottom, the third from the left. And yachting was a big deal in those days because it was definitely controlled by the wealthy. And through the years, Morton had a ton of different boats. And he was a member of the New York Yacht Club, and he established a substation of the New York Yacht Club in New London. And this is a drawing and a photograph of that small little clubhouse that was located down off of what is now Pequot Avenue. But this yacht here was the Yolanda, and it was a huge steamship. And Morton spent about 10 or 11 months at one point sailing all over on this yacht without Nellie. And so it's interesting because of the expectations of his workers. So again, it sort of shows two sides of things. So on the one hand, the people who worked on his yachts were seeing places that most people in that time, in the early 1900s, were not seeing, did not get to travel to. So he was going to Egypt, and he went to Venice and to through the Adriatic and around Africa, and he went to China, all on the Yolanda. And so they could see these marvelous things, but the standards were very, very tough. So here's just a little bit from, there was a little leather-bound volume called Particulars of the Steam Yacht Yolanda, 1908, in which Plant compiled like all the rules for his employees. And so the employees ranged from chefs and maids to deckhands and officers. When the boat was in commission, the work days began at 5 a.m. and workers were expected to work for 12 hours or more every day. They couldn't smoke, they couldn't shout, they couldn't make any needless noise. And if they encountered anybody who was a Plant family member or one of their friends, they were supposed to disappear. So they were warned to stay out of the spaces where the guests or the owners might be found. And so there was, again, this kind of opportunity, but the other side was that there was really exacting standards. So the times, though, were, I think, very similar to what we are in today in terms of the income gap. There is this smallish number, we call them like the 1%. But in 1890, for example, 11 million of the nation's 12 million families earned less than $1,200 a year. And the average income actually in that group was only $380 a year. And that kept them well below the poverty line of the time. So even though the amount of money, the values changed a lot in the, from then to now, $380 a year was still kept them below the poverty line. Rural Americans and new immigrants crowded into the urban areas, tenements spread across city landscapes, and they were teeming with crime and filth. So the conditions were the conditions, and these wealthy people kind of perpetuated these conditions. So now I'm going to get to the good stuff. I promised some gossip. I think that's probably why you're all here. So I'm going to, there's a ton of stories about pretty much every Plant family member. But I'll tell one or two about each. I got to check the time. Okay. And so the wealthy people of that time period were the celebrities of that era. And some of the very wealthy really relished that role, and others were more private. So Harknesses, for example, were very, very private, and they weren't written up in the newspapers very much. And, people knew of them, but they didn't know much about them. The Plants were very different. They were much more public, and they were always in the newspapers about one thing or another. So, for example, there was several fights, very public fights over wills. The first one had to do with Morton's father, Henry. And when Henry Bradley Plant died in 1899, which was really when Morton finally came into his own. He was already in his 40s by this time. Henry Bradley Plant did not have much respect for his son, actually. And I'll tell another story about that when I get to Henry Bradley. But there was a very, very public court fight over Henry Bradley Plant's will that involved Morton and Morton's stepmother, because Henry Bradley didn't want them to have all of his money that he made. And so he very carefully set up a system where they wouldn't just be given this glom of wealth. They'd be given enough to live on and live on comfortably, but that was it. But Morton and his stepmother fought against it, and they ultimately won. But it was a long fight. The other thing, another piece of kind of gossip about Morton was that I mentioned his second wife and I mentioned his third wife, but I didn't mention his first wife yet. Morton was married for just about a year to a woman named, that would really have been gossip in those days, to a woman named Ida Parsons. She was from Northampton, and she was from a very well-known, kind of established, long Yankee line in Northampton. And when they got married in the 1870s, there was a long, detailed write-up about the wedding and what everybody wore and who was there and all these details. And then poof, it just, Ida disappeared. And it's evident that they got divorced, but what happened in their marriage, where they lived, what they did, why they broke up, it was never public that I could find. And they might have lived in Boston for a little time, because I know Morton did live in Boston, but for whatever reason, it must have been a disastrous marriage, because they were not married for more than a year. And then when they split up, Ida did remarry, and she is buried in the Midwest in Ohio, where she moved with her second husband. And she probably, by the dates and by some evidence in the cemetery there, she probably died in childbirth. But it's really kind of a mystery what the deal was with that marriage. And the bigger issue was that it was kind of never spoken about in the papers or by anybody who talked about Morton. Nellie was always referred to as his first wife, but she wasn't. Another issue with the Plants was the relationships between the parents and the children that kind of carried on over 3 or 4 different generations. So Morton Plant did not see his father and mother more than 3 or 4 times a year. He was raised largely by his grandparents in Branford and New Haven. And his father was busy building railroads down in Florida and throughout the South. And so occasionally he would come up and visit his son, but very, very occasionally. And at one point there was this decision, they were having a birthday party for the father down in Florida at one of his Florida resorts. And the Henry Bradley made a big speech about that included some disparaging remarks about his son. And he ended up saying that he would give all his money to his grandson, who at that point was only like five or 6 months old, and just sort of overlook his son Morton completely. So, and that pattern though was repeated between Morton and his son, and then his son and his grandchildren. So there was never a lot of a really strong father-child bond in the Plant family. So Nellie was a really kind of traditional Victorian kind of woman. She stayed in the background for the most part, let Morton take the lead. But I think what is really fascinating about her is that she was educated. She was well-read, well-written. She was actually the person who designed Branford House. And she also designed the buildings that the Plant family gave that on Connecticut College's campus. So she probably was the one, as I said earlier, who influenced the big donation that made Conn College possible. Nellie ended up dying of typhoid in 1913. And there's a lot of evidence that Nellie was Morton's kind of love of his life, because Maisie, who looks a little different in this portrait because she was older, but if you look at pictures of she and Nellie at about the same age, they look amazingly similar. So there is an interesting story about how Morton won Maisie. And there are different versions that were told, and so it's hard to say which is completely accurate. Maisie was a teacher in Waterford. She was living with her husband, Selden Manwaring, in Oswegatchie. And Selden ran a hotel in Oswegatchie Hills. And when Morton saw her, he was just supposedly so taken by her. And there is a similar story about when Selden Manwaring first came across her that was similar, that she supposedly was, again, this picture I don't think does her justice, but she was supposedly just gorgeous and apparently had a great personality too, very vivacious. So anyway, she was still married to Selden Manwaring when Morton met her, and he decided he wanted to marry her. And so the story, there's two stories. One is he gave Selden $1 million and said divorce her. And then the second story is he told Selden Manwaring, if you don't divorce her, I will spread all kinds of rumors about you. And so you better divorce her. So at any rate, he did divorce her. Selden probably made out in that deal financially, and Morton got Maisie. Now, Maisie was his trophy wife. She was 30 years younger than him, and Nellie had only been dead less than a year when he married Maisie, and they got married at Branford House. So this again is Henry Bradley Plant. This is the fellow who made the Plant fortune. And again, the interesting thing about, there's quite a lot of interesting stories about him as well. But one that I think was particularly interesting is that he was, again, remember I said he was a Republican? He was with this, the party of Lincoln and all that. But he actually worked for the Confederacy while the Civil War was going on. And somehow he was able to keep the contract with the Confederacy. he brought the Confederate soldiers their pay, actually, their salaries via one of his railroads. But he had to get out of the country during the Civil War because the Confederates really didn't want Connecticut Yankees down in the South doing business with him. But he still maintained those ties and was able to do the business even though he was out of the country. And so he had kind of again, two sides to him, and maybe it was about convenience. Henry is, again, he is the plant, Morton and Nellie's only known biological son. Very handsome fellow. Again, there was not much a relationship between Morton and Henry. Henry was sent to boarding school quite early. He attended school at the Pomfret School, which is up in northeastern Connecticut, and the Plant family gave an awful lot of money to the Pomfret School. Henry died quite young, around the age of 40, and he was living on a yacht, so he shared Morton's love of yachting. He was living on one of his yachts in Miami at the time of his death. And he was supposed to have been with a woman who was not his wife at the time. He also was probably an alcoholic, and his wife and two young daughters were actually at Branford House at the time of his death. And finally, Philip and the chicken. So Philip again was Maisie's son, Maisie and Selden Manwaring's son. She insisted that Morton adopt him, and he did. Philip was known as a playboy, and he always was making the papers because of his exploits with cabaret dancers and actresses from Broadway and movie starlets from the silent screen. And he was actually driving a car in New York, in Pelham, New York, when there was a serious accident. He probably was drunk. And one of the young women who was packed in the car with him, there was 5 or 6 of them in there, and was really, really seriously injured. And so it made the papers, and it was a big deal that was written about for quite a while. Philip actually married a woman named Constance Bennett, who was a silent movie star. And Constance was known for taking lawsuits all the time. So one of the lawsuits that she took occurred after Philip's death, when she contended that her son was actually Philip's son, even though she had never made that claim while Philip was alive. She did end up winning some money for her son from Philip's estate. And it was interesting because when I was just preparing for this talk, I found online that on eBay or one of those types of sites, there is a letter for sale if you want to buy it. There is a letter that was written by Philip Plant in which he is lamenting and complaining bitterly that the papers always identify him as a playboy, and he's not a playboy anymore. So the reason why he's with this chicken is that he also shared a little bit of Morton's interest in agriculture and kind of raising the epitome of different species of livestock. And so he inherited the land from his father, his biological father, Selden Manwaring, in Oswegatchie. And so he lived over there in his last years, and he raised exotic birds. And so, well, chicken's not exactly exotic, but apparently, you know, the best of the finest specimens of types of chickens. But neighbors started complaining about, they said, you know, they referred to this place as Philip Plant's Zoo in Oswegatchie. And they didn't love it too much. I did mention that that Henry Plant was the only known biological son of Nellie and Morton. But there was an interesting detail in Morton's will that leads me to believe there might have been some other children, although none came forward to claim money. So maybe not. But in Morton's will, there were 2 individual women mentioned, one from New Jersey and one from New York, I believe. And I couldn't really find anything out about them particular, but Morton gave them money in his will that was, you know, that was to be paid like over their lifetimes in regular increments. And the wording that he put in the will was for valuable services rendered. So we're not quite sure what that was about, but we can, those of us with skeptical minds might think that what those valuable services were. I mean, it would not be too unusual that wealthy men of his era were philanderers. That was pretty common. But ultimately, you know, the Plant family, just like all the other wealthy people of their time, could not escape the diseases that were still prevalent. I mentioned that Nellie died of typhoid. Morton died in the flu pandemic of 1918. Both Philip and Henry died around the age of 40. They were both heavy drinkers and had heart conditions. So they were prone to the same diseases as everybody else was at that time. This is the Morton Plant's headstone or family plot in Cedar Grove Cemetery here in New London. Nellie is buried there. Morton is buried there. His son Henry is buried there. And then right across, Maisie is buried and Philip is buried. So Maisie picked out a plot that was strategically located very close to the Plant family plot.